It says we're live. We are live. We are live, and I'm coming at you with five. Welcome to another edition of my channel, GBoo2786. This is Gavin Richard with Gavin Richard Presents. I hope all is well, whoever you are, wherever you are, that out of everything, you're making the most out of this beautiful Sunday, although we're probably doing it from indoors now, but it's still a productive day, and make it productive wherever you are. Let me just turn my lights on for a second, Tom. Hold on.
Okay.
We have a very special guest, ladies and gentlemen, all the way from Los Angeles, California, uh, attorney Tom Mesereau. And Tom, of course, many of you may know he has represented high-profile clients from Michael Jackson to Bill Cosby, Robert Blake, as well as Mike Tyson briefly. But Tom, one of the great things that he has done as an attorney is that he is involved in a pro bono clinic that you do in Inglewood, I believe, Tom?
Yes. In South Los Angeles. It's in Inglewood. We meet at a church 2 Saturdays a month, and lawyers and law students and college students and activists donate their time to help people in need. And we invite people with any legal problem, civil or criminal, to come, and we'll help them as best we can.
Right. I was in a criminal clinic as well at Southern, so that's great to hear, especially to help with people who are who are indigent and can't afford an attorney. So it's very good to give back. So thank you for joining the program today, Tom.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor. I appreciate it very much, Gavin.
Yeah. Now, Tom, you were born in New York, correct? West Point, New York?
Yes. My father was a West Point graduate. And I was, my parents were stationed at West Point, and I was born at West Point Hospital.
Okay, yeah, New Yorker here.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
And so you're correct me if I'm wrong, but you refer to yourself as Tom Mesereau, and Thomas is your dad.
Yes, I'm Thomas Arthur Mesereau Jr. My father was Thomas Arthur Mesereau.
Okay, but I mean, you don't like people calling you Thomas. You prefer Tom, right?
I prefer Tom, thanks. Yes.
Okay, it's no problem. And I just to look at, I also put up your website for your law firm, Mesereau Law Group. Is it mesereaulaw.com?
Yeah, Mesereau at mesereaulaw.com. Yes.
Yes, and Tom has, you can look at his biography as well as a list of his practice areas. Tom does, your focus primarily, I believe, is just criminal law, which includes both federal and state trials and white collar crimes. Could you tell some of the people what are white collar crimes and the difference between that and the state?
Well, white collar crimes are typically nonviolent crimes. They involve business relationships for the most part. They can involve fraud. They can involve bank fraud, loan fraud, real estate fraud, that kind of thing. Crimes involving, financial transactions more than allegations of violent crime.
Right. And go ahead, Tom.
Well, I do both. I've done my share of murder cases. I do handle a murder case every year for free in Alabama. I've been doing that for 20 years.
Wow.
I did one pro bono death penalty case in Mississippi many years ago. But I have a friend of mine in Birmingham, Charles Salvaggio, who's a well-known criminal defense attorney, and he and I discuss every year what case I'll go down and do with him pro bono, and I do that. But at the same time, I also do healthcare fraud and bank fraud. I tried 3 mortgage fraud cases coming out of the 2008, economic collapse. 2 of them were in Los Angeles. One was in New Jersey. They were all in federal court. I've represented public officials who were charged with some type of malfeasance, political crimes, financial crimes. These kinds of things are primarily what I do in the white collar area.
Oh, good, great. I've not been that exclusive as an attorney. I haven't been that exclusive with my area like that as far as white collar. I mean, I'll take I don't turn anything down. I've done criminal defense and I've also done family law, but you just stick to criminal.
Yes.
Yeah. And you also, I think in 2016, I saw that you were listed as Trial Lawyer of the Year by trial attorneys.
That was the national trial lawyers
That's,
in Miami, Florida. They pick a criminal defense attorney every year to get their national award, and they picked me. Yes, I was very honored.
yeah, I get letters from them all the time. Too.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they try and get you money. But congrats on that. And I mean, you got a whole slew of awards, Tom. I'm just looking at them. You got an actual section with awards so people can look at it. Mr. Criminal Defense Lawyer of the Year by Century City Bar Association. Uh, each year, the Litigation Council of America they have a award named after you, the Mesereau Cup.
They do. It's called the Mesereau Cup. They award it to someone in criminal law who meets certain criteria, innovation, courage, dedication, things like that. We've given it to judges and lawyers as well. And this year, we're going to give it to a friend of mine who unfortunately passed away the year before last. My wife and I had dinner with he and his wife in late December. He was looking fantastic. And then about 3 weeks later, he passed away suddenly at the age of 59. His name was Jeff Adachi. He was the public defender in San Francisco, one of the finest criminal lawyers I've ever been honored to meet. He ran an impeccable office. Many considered it the best run public defender's office in the country. He made sure to try high profile cases. He had just won an acquittal in a high profile murder case in San Francisco. He defended a former lawyer who was acquitted of homicide. He produced movies about the justice system. He was working on his 5th film. He was working on 2 books, his own memoirs, and a story about a true case that happened in San Francisco decades ago. It was a public defender who went on trial for murder. I think this was in the 1930s. And he was just so dedicated to what he did, so dedicated to justice, and unfortunately died of a heart attack very, very early in life. And this year he's going to get the Mesereau Cup posthumously. His name is Jeff Adachi, Adachi. Wonderful person. You can look him up.
And we'll do. Sorry to hear that. But yeah, congrats to him on the on his work that he did. Public defenders often get a bad rap because a lot of people think that, well, they're tied up with all of these cases that they don't look out for their clients. But in often cases, and especially myself, I'm doing contract work for the public defender's office. They put in a lot of work for each client.
Well, they're the heroes of our criminal justice system.
Right.
They absolutely are. And as you said before, they're basically unsung heroes. They sometimes get a bad rap, but I'll tell you, generally speaking, they're, I tend to think your typical public defender is probably better than your typical private practitioner. They have resources, they have dedication, they have colleagues to rub shoulders with on any issue. And I've seen some public defenders give incredible defenses to very difficult people in very difficult situations. So I have the greatest respect for our public defenders. They are definitely the heroes of our justice system.
Right. And we're also underpaid.
Yes.
Grossly underpaid. Here in Louisiana, they're even with this coronavirus pandemic, but even before that, they were having trouble with funding. Where they would get monies and so forth from the state. So I know what it's like. Yeah, definitely. And of course, we're gonna keep people asking me to talk about Bill Cosby and Michael Jackson. That's something we'll do in a little bit. But I did want to bring this up too. You also started out as at one point you did private. You worked with a private attorney, but you were also a prosecutor at one point.
I was the prosecutor for about a year. I was a fish out of water. It took me about a week to realize I didn't want to be there. My heart wasn't in prosecuting troubled people, prosecuting people who, but for the grace of God, I could be in their situation. And I realized very quickly, I'll never forget, my first job as a prosecutor was in juvenile hall. And I got a tour of the juvenile facility. And during that tour, I looked through a window, through a metal door. I saw a young girl just kneeling on the ground with her face in her hands. And I found out that was a suicide watch facility. And to my horror, the first case I was asked to prosecute was a shoplifting case with this girl. And I went through her file, and she had been the subject of all kinds of abuse, physical, emotional, sexual. She had a drug problem. She'd been shipped from one foster home to another. And the case was dead bang. I mean, anybody could have won the case. I mean, she was caught cold. She confessed. There were a bunch of witnesses. It was a very, minor crime as far as I was concerned. And my first thought was, I want to give her help. I don't want to prosecute this person. And I was, told the prosecutor I did. Obviously, it was a win. And when I went upstairs, I felt disgusted, and everybody wanted to high five me for the victory. And I said to myself, this is not where I belong.
Right.
So I lasted the year and then went back into private practice.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's definitely, you got to do what's in your heart. And, so you weren't feeling that and you went into defending, being a criminal defense attorney. Now, I want to ask you, attorney to attorney, because I get this when I went into law school and after I came out, I had family members asking me, well, Gavin, how can you represent someone, that is guilty? And I've always told them, well, I don't look at it as just that I'm representing that person. I look at it as I'm representing that person's constitutional rights to due process and to having an attorney. Is that a way that you look at it when you represent criminal defendants?
Well, the way I see it, I'm doing two primary things. One, I'm giving justice to the client, and two, I'm making our system work. If we don't have vigorous, competent defense attorneys making the prosecutor prove their case, making the police, the FBI, the postal inspectors, the INS, whoever it may be, make them follow the ethical guidelines and do lawful behavior, if we don't make sure that happens, all of us are less free. So my feeling is you're not only giving justice to your client, which everyone has a right to. I don't care what they've done or what they haven't done. I don't care who they are, where they're from, how much money they have, how much education they have. Everyone has a right to due process and fundamental fairness and equality and all of the rights and privileges that our constitutions give us. In addition, if everyone in the system doesn't do their job right, the judge, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the jurors, the bailiff, the witnesses, you name it, if everyone doesn't do their job properly, our system breaks down and it's not nearly as effective as we want it to be.
Absolutely.
I think we have the best system in the world, but it's far from perfect. Innocent people are convicted. People are convicted of things they didn't do. People are sometimes overcharged in an abusive way. Confessions are forced out of people. Evidence is tampered with. You'll see police reports that are written in a very, unfair way, very dishonest way. You've got to keep everyone on their toes and make sure they do the right thing. And the only way that can happen is if vigorous, competent, aggressive defense attorneys walk into court and do their job.
Amen. Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And speaking of competent attorneys, I was just curious, but did you know you knew Johnnie Cochran?
I did. I'm very blessed to have known him. And, I was not a close friend of his. It wasn't like I was hanging out with him all the time, but I knew him. We got awards together, and he recommended me to the Jackson family as the one who could win the Michael Jackson case. And I'll never forget, his generosity to me in that regard. And unfortunately, he passed away in the middle of the Michael Jackson trial. Michael and I both went to his funeral. I wanted the judge to give me permission to go. He wouldn't. But it turned out, coincidentally, there was no trial that particular day. So Michael and I took a limousine from Santa Barbara County into Los Angeles, which is south of Santa Barbara County. It was about a 3-hour ride, and went to his funeral. And after the Jackson acquittal, I wrote an article about him, what I thought about him. It was published in the Daily Journal newspaper, which is the legal newspaper in California. And I basically ended it by saying he was the greatest criminal defense attorney I ever saw. And to this day, I still have that opinion. He truly was remarkable.
He was. He was he was one of the reasons why I became a lawyer, or the reason,
Well, he was originally from Louisiana.
Yes, he was from Shreveport, I
Right.
believe, his family. And he relocated to California as a kid with his family. Shreveport is about 4 hours from here. But
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, he relocated up there. I know he spent time as a prosecutor at one point, and this was during the time of course, segregation and racism. He wasn't allowed to even ask questions as a prosecutor at that time. I can
Well, I think you're
remember.
talking about what was called a coroner's inquest in Los
I'm
Angeles.
sorry. Yeah.
They used to call this type of proceeding a coroner's inquest. Let me tell you what happened in that, because that's the first case that made him famous in Los Angeles. A African American man from Georgia was trying to get his wife to the hospital. She was giving birth in the car. And in the small town in Georgia where he was from, they had a custom that if you had an emergency, you took a piece of white cloth, you tied it to your aerial, and you drove past the speed limit to get to the hospital or the police department, wherever you had to go. And it was understood that if you saw someone doing that, it was an emergency. Well, he did the same thing in Los Angeles, and he was shot dead. He was trying to
Oh,
get his wife to the hospital. It was a terrible tragedy, and it got a lot of publicity in Los Angeles. And Johnnie Cochran took the case, and they had what is called a coroner's inquest, which, as you correctly said, the defense attorney wasn't allowed to do certain things. He was allowed to ask some questions, but his ability to inquire into this was severely curtailed. And he was questioning the coroner who had done the autopsy. And to make a long story short, it was not a win for him given the way the laws were, but it gave him tremendous publicity for his aggressiveness, his intellect, his personality, his skill as a lawyer. And that really started him on his way to becoming the greatest criminal defense lawyer of my lifetime.
yeah. Well, I don't think you said defense lawyer. What? I don't think he was a defense lawyer at that time, or was he? He was.
I believe he was. I'd have to go back and check, but he was a prosecutor. He spent a lot of
Right.
time in the city attorney's office. Um, and the city attorney's office prosecuted misdemeanors, and he would sometimes have 2 jury trials a day early in his career. But I could be wrong, but I believe I think he just left the office, was a defense attorney when he took this case. I'd have to double check.
Yeah. Well, I just remember him. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
That was
Yeah.
definitely an unbelievable trial, and his closing arguments should be watched by any criminal
Oh,
defense
yeah.
lawyer. The closing arguments for the defense were Johnnie Cochran, then Barry Scheck from New York, and then Johnnie Cochran, and they complemented each other so well. These great defense attorneys, and yes, he did. He'd use that phrase: "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." But the defense was a lot more than just that phrase. The
Oh,
defense
most
was
definitely. I actually they had one of the miscarriages of the show, the miniseries that I don't know if you saw the People versus OJ Simpson miniseries. They made it look like they made Johnny look like a charlatan, and the other thing was that they made it seem like the defense didn't put on a case. When I watched the trial like everyone else, the defense had actually just about as many witnesses as the prosecution did. Uh,
sure.
and television, of course, it's called television programming for a reason because it's to control people. Uh, and certainly, yeah, with Johnnie Cochran, and then they tried to even slander Johnny with domestic abuse allegations as a result. Sometime after he died, which I thought was ridiculous.
Well, look, the defense was absolutely brilliant in that case. The trial was 9 months long. That's a long time. It took
Yeah,
over America. It was better than any TV series it ever produced. I mean, it just took over the country for those 9 months. And the defense definitely put on a case. They had an incredible array of experts. They had incredible witnesses. And because of what the defense did in that case, police labs all over the country spent billions of dollars upgrading their facilities because of the incredible attack by the defense on the way evidence was handled or mishandled. The science of the lab testing that went on was attacked for being unsanitary, sloppy, unprofessional, unscientific. And I mean, they exposed things that had never been exposed in a criminal trial before. and resulted in enormous change in the way cases are prosecuted and the way they're investigated, particularly the science of investigation. It was a phenomenal, monumental defense. And I didn't watch that series. I saw bits and pieces of it. But if that's the way it portrayed it, it was definitely not realistic at all.
No, it wasn't. And certainly, I remember watching that trial every day. I was about 8 years old when the whole thing started. So I remember it from beginning to end. And I felt that the prosecutors just didn't prove their case.
Well, let me tell you, as I said before, any aspiring defense attorney or any existing defense attorney needs to watch Johnnie Cochran and Barry Scheck's closing arguments. Now, these are from 25 years ago. And
Yeah.
I'm telling you, Johnnie Cochran's closing was so unbelievable. I mean, I remember while I was watching it, Court TV was producing it and broadcasting it, not producing it, excuse me, broadcasting the live coverage. And during a break, they went back to New York where they had a panel of experts analyzing what was going on. And one of them was the district attorney of Brooklyn, a fellow named Hines, who passed away not that long ago. And he made a comment I never forgot. He said, I've been teaching at law schools throughout New York all my career. And I always teach lawyers, don't make your closing argument too long. You'll lose the jury, you'll bore them. Make some pretty clear, concise, easy to understand points. Say what they are and sit down. He said, after what I'm watching, I've got to go back and reconsider everything I've been teaching. He said, this is monumental what I'm watching. I mean, it was such an incredible closing. It had you riveted for days.
Yeah.
I mean, it really did. His emotional range, his ability to emphasize. He came from a family of preachers in Louisiana, and a lot of his ability to present himself and convince people of what he wanted, I think, had to do with a lot of the preaching in his background that he'd been exposed to. But he just keeps people spellbound for hour after hour after hour. It's astonishing. I'll never forget it.
He was Johnnie
Gavin? 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 Okay, we lost them. Gavin? 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 Hello? Gavin? What happened?
Tom? Hello? All right, guys. I'm sorry about that. My internet, I don't know what's been going on. I have it extended and it froze out on me. We're going to try and get Tom back in. Hold on. I think he's back. Tom?
Yes. Hi, we got cut off. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh.
No, it's me, man. My internet, I don't know what's going on. I haven't, certain parts of the house are dead zones, but I have an extension to it. And it's my first time trying it, so I don't know I hope it doesn't go out again. So sorry about that, everyone.
I think when we left off, we were talking about Johnnie Cochran's closing argument in the OJ Simpson case.
Yeah.
But Gavin, I just thought of something. I'm pretty sure I'm correct. When Johnnie Cochran represented Mr. Deadweiler in the case we were talking about earlier in Los Angeles, they had what is called a coroner's inquest. It was a public proceeding, but the defense attorney could not ask a question directly. The defense attorney could submit written questions which were asked by someone else.
Okay.
And as I recall, Johnnie kept submitting questions, and the person who presented the question to the coroner would say, Mr. Cochran asked the following, Mr. Cochran asked the following. And he did so many questions that throughout Los Angeles, the words Mr. Cochran asked the following were reverberating everywhere. And it was a first step towards becoming the best criminal defense lawyer in America and the most famous one.
Right, you're correct. I'm actually looking at the Wikipedia page. He represented the African-American widow who sued several police officers who had shot and killed her husband, Leonard Deadweiler.
Yes.
That's correct. Right. And after passing the bar exam in 1963, this is very interesting, he took a position as a city attorney in the criminal division, the deputy city attorney, and he prosecuted the following year the famous comedian Lenny Bruce on obscenity charges.
That's right. That's right. He also saw what was happening with police brutality in minority communities. And he writes in his first book, he wrote two wonderful books, which again, any criminal defense lawyer would benefit from reading. In his first book, he mentioned the fact that as a city attorney, they prosecuted misdemeanors. And what would happen was when the police brutalized someone in the inner city, they would then charge them with a misdemeanor resisting arrest. And the misdemeanor resisting arrest was purely designed to defeat the civil action which was going to come. And at one point, Johnnie Cochran went to his superiors and said, I will not prosecute resisting arrest cases anymore because I can see what's going on. They're not being brought in good faith. These police officers are contriving evidence and contriving facts, and they're just doing it to defeat any civil case after they abuse someone's civil rights. And he refused to do it, and they said they would not give him those cases to prosecute anymore.
Wow.
Yeah, his two books are just wonderful.
I'm gonna have to put that on my reading list.
They're really good.
Okay, I'm gonna definitely check them out. Do you know the titles of them?
One of the last one was
Share
called
with the
A Lawyer.
audience. Let's see.
There's, I think, Journey to Justice, and there's a lawyer's life. Hello? Hello? You there? You there? So I have this.
Tom? Tom?
Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry about that, man. I just went ahead. I had to move out of that studio, and I'm in a different part of the house now where the internet's a little better.
Okay, no problem at all.
So yeah, we're back, people. Let me just apologize to my audience for the technical difficulties. Yeah, we were talking about Johnnie, and you had mentioned his two books that he had. Uh, I'll post those in a little bit because I'm searching online for Amazon. But
I believe they're called Journey to Justice and A Lawyer's Life.
yeah, I think that is it. Let's see. Yeah, Lawyer's Life and Journey to Justice. He wrote one in 2001 and the other was in 1996. Yeah.
Right, right. Great books. Recommended highly.
Okay. Yeah. Some people just want to read the comments. I don't know if you can see these, Tom, but I have several. One is from Kate. She says, Tom, T. Mez is my hero. She also wanted me to tell you, don't ever change.
Well, thank you very much.
That's Kate.
Appreciate the
Yeah.
appreciate the compliment. Thank you.
Yeah. Some people say, Jay Bart says, this is a wonderful interview. Thank you. A lot of Journey to Justice is good from Nicole's view. Someone has a Michael Jackson question. I'll be getting into that in a minute. But Tom, since we're talking about Johnnie, Johnnie represented Michael in his 1993 case, if I'm correct.
That's correct.
Right. And of course, in that case, people have always assumed that because Michael supposedly settled with the accuser, which was Jordy Chandler, and I think the mother's name was June. They
Yes.
and Evan Chandler. They're assuming because he did that, he was guilty of something because someone doesn't pay that amount of money. But my information from my resources tells me that Michael did not actually pay this out. This was his insurance company that did this.
Well, there's some controversy about that. I've talked to people who were involved in the settlement, and insurance may have paid some. It didn't pay all of it, according to Carl Douglas, who, with Johnnie, was representing Michael. But let me tell you this. I don't know if you remember this infamous Bashir documentary, which got the ball rolling in 2003 and ended up with Michael being prosecuted in a long trial where I defended him and he was acquitted.
I
Well,
remember it.
when Bashir was interviewing him, he asked Michael about that settlement. And Michael said, look, I did not want to put my family through an OJ type situation. I wanted to end all this crazy publicity. And Bashir did not include that in his documentary. And the reason I know about it is Michael had his own videographer during all those interviews. I got a hold of the outtakes that were not included. And we played those outtakes for the jury in his criminal trial. Michael basically was advised by certain people that to settle no matter what it costs because you're the best known entertainer in the world. There are billions of dollars you're going to be making in the future, and get rid of this bad publicity. And on top of that, Michael didn't want to put his family through all this, so that's why he settled it.
Right. And it should note because I've been involved in civil settlements before. People just settle things because they just wanted to get away. It's not an admission of guilt
No,
by law.
in fact, the settlement agreement specifically said this is not an admission of any liability at all. Both sides agreed to put that language
Right, right. And yeah, I've done those before.
in.
Yeah, I've gotten settlements for clients before. And so in representing Michael, and I know you've been asked this before by people, but I would like to ask it. What was he like? Well, how did you meet Michael first off, if you don't mind me asking? I know you said
Well,
Johnnie.
his brother Randy and I had been friendly for years, and we would get together periodically for dinner and just chat. We hadn't really done business together, but Randy called and wanted me to defend Michael, and one thing led to another, and there I was, lead counsel.
Right. And I think Michael was being represented by Mark Garagos at one point.
He
Uh,
was, I replaced Garagos.
right, right. And I still remember the day when Michael showed up for his arraignment, and you had like 20,000 people out there cheering for him. And he had a red carpet rolled out almost.
Well, didn't have a red carpet rolled out. What happened was the DA's office in Santa Barbara County, which again is north of Los Angeles County, they originally filed a criminal complaint. And that's when Mr. Garagos and then Mr. Braffman from New York were representing Michael. The DA's office then changed their strategy. They decided to indict him by way of a grand jury.
Right.
And if they had continued with the filed complaint, they would have had to have a public preliminary hearing where the prosecution would have, in public, in front of a judge, would have had to produce enough evidence to convince a judge that the case should go forward. When they changed their strategy, they decided not to have a public proceeding. They had a secret grand jury meet in a secret location with no judge in the room, no defense attorney in the room, no cross-examination whatsoever from a defense point of view. And they did it secretly. They presented whatever witnesses they wanted. They asked them whatever questions they wanted without any control by a judge. And they asked the grand jury to return an indictment, which the grand jury did. When the grand jury indicted him, that's when Randy came to me. I had been approached months earlier, but I couldn't get involved because I was defending Robert Blake in his case. But Blake and I were in the middle of jury selection and had a falling out. It was a very high profile case, and I withdrew from the case. And then Randy called me later on and said, you know, we've always wanted you. Would you consider doing this? We know you turned it down before. And I said, yes, I would consider doing it now. And I met with Michael secretly outside of Orlando, Florida. He was renting a house. It was done very secretly. Nobody knew about it. I was interviewed for a number of hours. I then flew home very secretly. And I didn't know if I'd ever hear from anybody again. And Randy called up pretty quickly and said, Michael wants to retain you as his lead criminal defense lawyer. And that started the ball rolling.
Yeah. Was he a nice person?
Extremely nice. One of the nicest people I've ever met. Kind, considerate, decent, gentle, with a conscience. I mean, I'll give you an example. The trial started in January of 2005. In the previous November, my only sibling, my sister, came down with terminal cancer. She had a tumor of the brain and a tumor of the lung, and it looked very bad. And we decided to have the brain tumor removed first. She had the brain tumor removed. The doctor was the neurosurgeon who operated on her, was very hopeful. And she didn't have the balance problems and the vision problems that normally accompany that serious a surgery. And he said, let her go home and convalesce for a couple of weeks, and then we'll do the lung surgery. Well, she went home. She lived in Irvine, California, which is south of Los Angeles. And she got to her home, and there was a bouquet of flowers bigger than the door. It was the biggest bouquet of flowers she'd ever seen in her life. She couldn't imagine who had sent this. There was an envelope attached to it. She opened it up, and there was a poem written to her by Michael, wishing her well. That's the kind of person he was.
Yeah, yeah. And I look at the work that Michael did. I mean, and I don't know, I never met Michael Jackson personally, but like everyone else around the world, the music, the charity work that he did, he touched a lot of people. And I personally believe that the charges were BS that he was facing, and he was facing about 14 different charges, 10 felonies, 4 misdemeanors. Is that right?
Well, he was indicted on 10 felonies.
Okay.
And as the case was about to go to the jury, the judge, on his own motion, not because the defense requested, not because the prosecution requested it, the judge, on his own initiative, decided to add a jury instruction which allowed the jury on the last 4 felonies, if they acquitted him, to consider what is called a lesser included misdemeanor. And I think that was throwing a life raft to the prosecution, just to help them get a conviction of some kind so they could say they won. And what the jury did was they acquitted him of the first 6 felonies. Then the last 4, as they acquitted him of each felony, they then considered a lesser included misdemeanor, and they acquitted him of the misdemeanors as well. So it was 14 not guilty verdicts.
Right. And I remember that day distinctly. That was, I believe, in That was June of 2005.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I remember we were coming home. I was coming home actually from school when they announced it on the radio because they actually read the jury decision in front on the radio because they wouldn't allow cameras in the courtroom or anything like that. So we that was the only time the judge allowed, I guess, us to hear what was going inside. And once it was read, my father and I, we were just cheering.
You weren't the only ones cheering.
Right. Did my did Michael do a dance move when he got acquitted afterwards?
No, Michael was very exhausted, very depleted. He looked the worst I'd ever seen him on verdict day. His cheeks were sunken in. He was thin. He was pale. He'd lost a lot of weight. He looked terrible, to be honest. And basically, after the last not guilty, he and I hugged, and he said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And he hugged everyone, and we all went back to Neverland. And it was not a wild party scene of any kind. It was a very subdued, relieved sort of feeling. A lot of praying going on, a lot of hugging. It's a day I'll never forget, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, Dick Gregory, who was a friend of mine, he even talked about how at one point Michael wasn't even eating because around that time he was very sick and he feared that his life was in danger.
Well, I
Uh,
remember Dick Gregory at the trial. That was towards the end, and I think Dick Gregory had a number of techniques he used to help people restore their health. And I'm trying to think, was it magnets? I can't think what he was using. I can't remember, but there was some nutritional therapy he was recommending for Michael, as well as some other exercises or things designed to help him rejuvenate himself because he was looking terrible.
yeah, yeah, and I know they had met actually on the set of The Wiz because Michael's lung had collapsed, and Dick Gregory, I guess, gave him a remedy to
Hmm.
fix it. And from that point on, they had been close. And
Sure.
yeah, and Dick would go there, would be at the trial if Mr. Jackson, I noticed, wasn't there. But I'm talking about Joe Jackson. But Joe Jackson was very involved in this case as well, and as well as Mrs. Jackson. She never missed a day, if I'm not mistaken.
Mrs. Jackson was there every single day. Mr.
Yeah,
Jackson was there many days, but
right.
Mrs. never skipped a day. Two things let me mention in response to what you just said. First of all, as far as the show The Wiz, there's a story about that show and Michael's involvement that I really love. You know, Michael never took a dance lesson in his life.
Right.
And when he was a teenager, he was on the set of The Wiz, and people were not being friendly to him. They were being very cold. And he didn't understand it because he thought he was being nice to everybody. And one of the directors pulled him aside and said, "Michael, let me explain something to you." He said, "Everybody is working hard. They're sweating, they're exercising, they're working every day to get these moves down. All you do is watch someone do it, and then you do it better than that person. You do it perfectly." And he said, "They're jealous. Everybody's jealous. That's the problem." Michael just didn't understand why people were behaving the way they were. Um,
Right.
and as far as Joe Jackson, I have a funny memory of him that I'll never forget. I mentioned before that when the last not guilty came down, Michael and I hugged, and then the defense team hugged, and Joe Jackson came walking up to me with a big smile on his face, extended his hand, and he shook my hand. He said, "You're almost as good as me."
Yeah, Mr. Jackson, a lot of he gets a bad rap from a lot of people, but I mean, Mr. Jackson is the reason why there is a Michael Jackson and a Jackson 5. He, managed those kids and while working two jobs.
He was a steel worker, tough work.
Yeah,
And he had a dream of having a band and having his kids perform and succeed. And they were forced to rehearse till late hours in the morning and forced to perform on weekends. And look what he created, my God.
right. And not even his kid look, not even his the boys look at Janet, look at
Yeah,
Breezy, Latoya. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. And yeah, and shout out, I know he just passed away, but his impact is still felt because of the Jackson 5. There is a Boys to Men. There is a New Kids on the Block. There is a New
Right.
Edition. They all came out of that. So he did something good, and I think Michael even admitted later on in his life that his father did love him, and I'm glad that they were able to patch things up, before he passed. But a lot of people think that part of the accusations, at least me, it stemmed and from the fact that Michael owned this catalog with Sony and also with the owning Elvis and the Beatles. Did he? And I've heard him briefly talk about it with Jesse Jackson. He wouldn't get into it, but he said there was a big conspiracy. Did you think that had something to do with this?
Well, Michael always felt that because of his enormous wealth and talent and fame, that people were constantly trying to get something from him, and he was correct. Michael had trouble trusting any adult because so often he would think somebody was his friend and they would turn on him. They would want something he just was unwilling to give them. They would sue him. They would claim he promised them this and promised them that. And because he owned that catalog, which was very controversial in many circles, he bought that in the mid 1980s for something like $45 million. It had all the
Yeah,
Beatles songs and many other songs from
47 million,
other famous artists. And in the
right?
late 90s, I think he sold half of it for close to 100 million. I mean, that catalog gave him enormous power and influence in the music world. And he always felt that people were eyeing that catalog, trying to get a piece of it from him. Um, Look, I know this DA who was after him tooth and nail. I don't know if I don't think the DA himself was after the catalog, but people who wanted to see Michael disabled financially and disabled legally were, I'm told, trying to help the DA with his case.
Yeah,
So there could have been an unexpressed, unwritten, I call it a sort of an unexpressed conspiracy among people. There could have been, all of whom wanted to take Michael down for different reasons. Some with financial reasons, some reasons of jealousy, some reasons of just making a career out of it. I think a lot of people with different motives came together to try and sink Michael Jackson and take him down in that case. That I do believe.
yeah. Well, I specifically mentioned that because I know, for instance, when it's funny you mentioned the coroner's inquest about Johnnie Cochran, because I remember the late great Sam Cooke, who died, who was murdered under mysterious circumstances. There were people that thought Sam was killed because in the 1960s, as a black man, it was unheard of to own your own music publishing. And my understanding is that his family, they don't control that. And, I see what happened with Michael. I noticed, for instance, one part of my research is that the Wacko Jacko slur that started in the 80s, that actually came out of England, which is where the Beatles, of course, are from. So I always wonder if that had a lot to do with it. And also, my understanding too is that when Michael purchased the Neverland Ranch, Tom Sneddon, who I guess lives in that county, he didn't like that either. There's a book by the real estate agent that sold that property to Michael, I believe, that's out there. If someone's in the chat, they can find it for me, the name of it. But they stated that that was another reason about that he owned all of that land that was valuable. So, I mean, I don't put anything past him. So,
Yeah, no, Michael was unfortunately the most famous person in the world. I say fortunately and unfortunately because he achieved enormous heights that most of us will never even come close to being even experiencing what that could be like. But at the same token, he paid a terrible price for it because he was a huge target from everybody. He was perceived as very wealthy and very vulnerable, very kind, very gentle, very nice, very charitable, and at the same time with enormous wealth and fame. And you put all that together, and people just want to take advantage of it. And he was constantly fending off people trying to get something from him. It was a very difficult price to pay for what he accomplished, which was incredible.
right. And just to touch briefly back on the trial time, I won't take up too much of your time on that, but the other thing that's important now is in the wake of this Time's Up Me Too, you've had this docu-series. The R. Kelly has had the Surviving R. Kelly, and they've got the Women Against Cosby on CNN. And then, of course, you had this Leaving Neverland documentary by Dan Reed with the two accusers. one of whom testified on Michael's behalf, Wade Robson. Um, you went over his testimony with him, isn't that right? And
Listen, I had, when the prosecution rested their case in the Michael Jackson trial, I had to think long and hard about whether we were going to put on a defense case. Sometimes the defense just relies on cross-examination to get an acquittal. And so many of my cross-examinations were effective, if I may say so myself. I felt that we had just knocked around their witnesses so thoroughly that I had to decide if we wanted to risk putting on a defense case. Because when you put on a defense case, your witnesses are subject to cross-examination as well. And I decided, we would probably get a hung jury if I didn't put on a defense case, and I didn't want Michael experiencing a retrial. So I said, we're going to go all out for acquittal, and we're going to put on a defense case. Now, when you decide to put on a defense case, you want to start strong and end strong. Typically, a defense lawyer will start with a strong, convincing witness, hopefully end with a strong, convincing witness. And the witnesses that maybe aren't as compelling or as strong as the ones I just mentioned, you put them in the middle. You want to start strong and end strong. I started with Wade Robson. He was the most powerful witness for Michael Jackson. I sat with him at Neverland. His mother was there. His sister was there. I called them as witnesses as well because they had traveled with Michael. They had observed Michael. They had been in his bedroom, Wade Robson was intelligent. He was bright. He was articulate. And he was absolutely powerful in his defense of Michael Jackson. He said, the man did nothing improper to me, ever. And he was my first witness. He was a terrific witness for Michael Jackson. He was attacked viciously by a very skilled prosecutor, Ron Zonin, an excellent trial lawyer, and he would not fold. So for him, years later, when Michael's passed away, to come out with these scurrilous allegations, I find repulsive. And,
yeah,
I sat with him, and then I called him as a witness. And then after the trial, he went on television, singing Michael Jackson's praises, saying he never did anything like that to me. So I don't believe these current allegations for 1 second.
yeah. An important thing to point out too, Dan Reed, who is the director of the Leaving Neverland docuseries, according to the website mjvibe.com, they're saying that he may be broke and they're selling off their assets because of it. So a lot of people see this as karma, but I thought I never saw the docuseries, and I don't think you have seen it, but it seemed to be one of the most biased pieces of work. They didn't even contact the family, and I don't think they contacted you.
No, they didn't, and I won't watch it. I refuse to.
Right. All right. I refuse to watch it too. And HBO actually, the Jackson family actually sued HBO, or the state sued, because there was a clause in their contract that they had supposedly violated with Michael. But I think that case was, I don't know if it was settled or it was thrown out.
No, the case is still going on.
Oh, it's still going on.
Yeah,
Okay.
the estate sued HBO. It's still going on.
Okay, I apologize. Yeah, it's still going on, but there's been no official ruling just yet. So
Not yet, no.
yeah, well, that'll be interesting to see. Yeah, and you still keep in touch with the family?
Periodically, I talked to Randy not long ago. Once in a while, I saw Taj not long ago. Once in a while, Jermaine will call. So I do periodically, yes. And they're a very nice family, just a wonderful group of people.
Yeah, well, they are the first family of entertainment. That's the way I look at it. And
Absolutely.
yeah, Taj is. I've never met. I've spoken to Taj maybe through email once or so, but seemed very nice. Yeah. So yeah, and speaking of which, I guess people are waiting for me to get into this because how you and I met and talked was actually with the result of the Bill Cosby case. And, of course, we've been very active on Facebook and YouTube because I find that what happened to Dr. Cosby was a travesty of justice and a dangerous precedent. Tom has been set now, I think, in result of the climate that we're in. And I honestly believe that if social media had existed back in the time Michael Jackson was around, Michael probably would have been convicted, but thank God he didn't live through that.
Oh, let me say this. Let me say this. First of all, the media attempt to convict Michael was relentless. You know, I never saw such a poisoned atmosphere walking into that case. I had never seen anything like that. And I'll never forget the 8 days of jury deliberation in the Michael Jackson case. The major networks were showing the jail cell every hour where they said he was going to end up. And they were all speculating on what his day would be like in prison, what time he would get up, what he would eat, what he would wear, who would be allowed to visit him, would he be allowed to read, would he be on suicide watch, that kind of thing. So the media environment around Michael at that period was very bad, very, very bad. And the charges were horrendous too. I mean, what they said he had done was so ridiculous. I mean, if you know Michael. And then we get to Bill Cosby, which I have to tell you was the most unfair criminal trial I've ever been part of.
Oh
Without
yeah,
doubt, the most unfair I've ever been part of. The court, first of all, the court didn't even have jurisdiction to hear the case because that case had to be filed in a particular period of time. And they claim the events happened on a particular day. We got the alleged victims' phone records, Bill Cosby's phone records, both in Pennsylvania and New York. We got Bill Cosby's flight records. We got his entertainment itineraries. We got every record receipt imaginable and showed that the case could not have happened when they said it happened. And under the law, they've got to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the case was filed within the applicable statute of limitations, or they don't have the power, what we call in the law jurisdiction, to even hear the case.
right,
So we presented all this evidence to the judge with a motion to dismiss. He wouldn't have a hearing on it. He wanted to try the case. Then what he said was, we'll let the jury decide. And, you know, we presented the evidence in the trial, and he had a jury instruction that he buried within another instruction. And the jury instructions weren't even allowed to go into the jury room. So this judge, in my opinion, didn't even have the power or jurisdiction to hear the case.
right,
Second of all, the prior prosecutor had agreed not to prosecute Bill Cosby. He even testified under oath that he'd agreed not to prosecute Bill Cosby. And as a result of that, his lawyers let him get involved in a civil case that he shouldn't have been involved in. And even though that former district attorney said under oath, I agreed not to prosecute him, they let the case go forward with the next district attorney anyway. I mean, if a DA makes an agreement not to prosecute someone and there are ramifications and consequences and somebody relies on that agreement, that should hold some weight. This judge's attitude was, you know, well, it should have been in writing.
right,
So,
and right. And my issue with that, Tom, as you know, with someone that has practiced criminal defense law and been on both sides, once a prosecutor makes a promise not to prosecute, and defendant gives testimony, that's it. You know, there shouldn't be any prosecution of anything. And this was
no,
15 years ago.
it was a political prosecution because the DA who had made the agreement not to prosecute him was then defeated by his opponent in a vicious political race. And the opponent, while he was running for DA, was giving commercials saying, I'll prosecute Bill Cosby if I'm
Right.
elected. And it was strictly a political prosecution. In my opinion,
Well,
the
that's an
court
ethical violation too.
Oh, in my opinion, the court didn't have the power to hear the case, the jurisdiction to hear the case. There was an agreement by that office not to prosecute the case, which was just scuttled for political reasons. So you start off with this level of unfairness before you even get into the courtroom. Then you get into the courtroom, and the way the judge was conducting this thing, he had women come in from 30 years ago, making allegations against Bill Cosby. These are cases that were never prosecuted, never filed. You can't investigate them. You're going to go back 30 years to find witnesses and find forensic evidence and find the things you need to defend. Of course not. It was a travesty of justice from day one.
Right. Well, with all of that said, because some of the people who don't understand law, they're going to ask, well, how can something like this, if you're saying the judge didn't even have jurisdiction to hear the case, how could something like this happen in America?
Well, because, you know, America is a great country, but we're not perfect. And our legal system, is not a perfect system. As I said earlier, I consider it the best justice system in the world, but it's far from perfect. And if defense attorneys don't fight as hard as they can, these cases can become political. They can become self-serving in many ways that have nothing to do with due process or justice. And this is the most unfair trial I've ever been part of in my entire career.
In association with working with Mr. Cosby, what was he like, if you could tell us?
Extremely nice, decent person, one of the brightest people I've ever met, just knowledgeable of history and society and literature and Black history, and a great champion of civil rights, a very decent, honorable person to deal with. I've never had a nicer client to work with. Very kind, very decent, very outstanding human being, a national treasure as far as I'm concerned. It's just a travesty that he's behind bars. It's a travesty.
Yeah, it is. And at 80 years old and blind, and with the fear of the coronavirus, there have been people who, some of us on Facebook, some of my friends, I'd like to just give a shout out to someone, Miss Nicole Lewis from Nicole's View. She's been very adamant about Bill Cosby. There's actually a page on called the Bill Cosby is Innocent website. I believe I can send you the link later if you would like to check it out, Tom.
Sure.
And
Thank you.
but I want to tell everybody about that. And I'm looking at the comments. People are saying, "Yep, racist, illegal, unethical." Did you feel racism played a factor in this as well?
Well, let me give an example of that situation. During jury selection, there was an African American woman who was removed by the prosecution. That woman then contacted the defense, said that another juror, a white male, had made a comment, words to the effect that he's guilty, we won't be here long. So we
Right.
asked that that juror be removed. The judge had what he called a hearing and would not remove him.
Right, and to my knowledge, the witness, the juror number, this was juror 11, if I'm not mistaken. They asked him, did he said it, and he didn't confirm or deny it, and the judge let it go on. Right.
Well, no, he said, this is my recollection, the words to the effect, I don't recall saying that. That was the way that came out at the beginning. And then he denied very strongly that he had said it. But the first words were words like, I don't recall saying it, which I found rather interesting.
Yeah. They that I'm glad you brought that point up too, because that is a that right there violates the Sixth Amendment, if that's the case. And of course, Tom, you know what the Sixth Amendment is, and but those that don't know, it guarantees a right of a defendant to have a fair and impartial trial by jury, that it has to be speedy and public. It also gives him the right to have compulsory witnesses to testify on his behalf, and to also cross-examine opposing witnesses. And
Yeah, but you understand also that the way a judge controls a case and the way a judge uses his facial expressions, rolls his eyes, etc., can have an effect on the atmosphere in the courtroom. And in my opinion, this was, as I said before, I've said a number of times, and I'll say again, the most unfair criminal trial I've ever been part of.
yeah,
And as far as I'm concerned, it was a complete travesty of justice.
right. Nicole wanted me to tell you, if you can read the comments, she said, great interview. Tell Tom that I thought he won that case based on the closing arguments alone. Tom, she was actually in the courtroom on those days, as well as a few other friends here on the show. He said, she wants me to ask you, were you aware of the racist history of Montgomery County in Norristown, Pennsylvania?
Well, I had heard things to that effect, yes. But that's where the case was filed. That's where Bill Cosby had a home. It was near Philadelphia where he grew up. And I was hoping we'd get a diverse, fair, balanced jury.
Right, yeah. Uh, Stacey Brown, who was a journalist, he had written an article, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but they alleged that one of the jurors had been talking to an outsider during the trial for a book deal. Have you ever heard of
I don't have firsthand knowledge of that. Perhaps as appellate lawyers know more about that than I do.
Sure, sure. Yeah. I know I had friends at that trial, Tom, and they told me they could tell how biased there was. Nicole even talked about the reporters, right, the way they would write down their statements. They would write them every time the prosecution would give their argument, they would be writing. But then when it was your turn or Kathleen's turn to talk, they wouldn't be writing anymore. And could you tell us how was the press with regards to the Cosby case? Because it looked like it was a whole fiasco from the protesters that were out there. There was even a coffee shop across the street that had paraphernalia to the effect we support rape victims. And this is in view of the jury, I believe, seeing this. And I know that you guys even filed a motion to recuse the judge because his wife, I believe, is a sexual assault counselor. Could you talk about
Yes,
that a little bit? Okay.
we did make a motion to have the judge recuse himself because his wife was a very respected, very renowned, to my understanding, quite well known counselor of sexual abuse victims. Um, and we thought that efforts had been made to raise some money by one of her organizations to support one of the organizations that was against us in front of the courthouse. So we made a motion to that effect. It was denied.
Oh, man. He just sat on it.
He had a hearing and was not pleased. He asked me at one point, "Are you responsible for this?" I said, "Yes." I said, "We're all a team, but I'm the one responsible." And he was not happy and he denied the motion.
He wouldn't even hear your argument.
Oh, he heard the arguments. I mean, he didn't want to spend a tremendous amount of time on it, from my point of view. But he did have a hearing, and he said he would consider it. Then, of course, denied it.
Right. And it's such a shame that this happened to Mr. Cosby, because the work that, just like with Michael, this man gave more monies to historically black colleges and universities. Uh, he bailed out colleges that were failing. He, even if he didn't pay for them, he put it in the minds of our children that it was possible. Uh, and I,
He donated about $200 million that I'm aware of to
right.
social causes. Yes,
Well, I know.
he paid for people's educations that most of the public doesn't even know about. He did
Right.
try to help Black institutions of higher learning. He was very dedicated to civil rights, very dedicated to education, very dedicated to so many important causes that he didn't have to be involved in. He could have just enjoyed his fame and his wealth and not bother with this stuff. But that wasn't him. He's a very, very philanthropic, very kind, very sensitive guy who wanted to express himself in ways he thought would help American society and especially the African American community. He wasn't always, people didn't always agree with some of his hard messages, but they were heartfelt. He was trying to
Right.
do the right thing and expressing what he believed honestly and fairly and professionally with good intentions at all times. And it's sad to see this happen to him. But he's 82, by the way. Um,
Right.
just a sad situation and the most unfair trial in my entire long history as a lawyer.
Right. And just on the things that you mentioned alone, for instance, the interrogatories not being given to the jurors, that should be automatic grounds for throwing out this verdict. And my understanding from people that were actually at the appellate hearing, the justices weren't even interested in, I guess, listening to the defense. They kept interrupting them while they were talking. And they even at one point helped out the prosecutor with their questions.
I wasn't there. I'm not handling the appeal. So
Right.
I did hear something like you just expressed, but I really wasn't there to watch it.
Yeah, sure. Tyree Dominique, he wanted to ask Tom why the key witness for the defense wasn't allowed to testify. but I think he was talking about Marguerite Jackson. But she did testify, if I'm not mistaken.
She did testify in our trial. It took a lot of effort to get the judge to agree to let her in. He wouldn't let her testify in the first one
Right.
for reasons that are just mystifying. But she did testify in the retrial.
Yeah. And I want to ask you, I got to ask you this though. What was it like cross-examining Janice Dickerson?
Well, she wasn't fond of me. She'd written some books that were quite interesting, and she claimed she was just taking poetic license. And that I would cross-examine her on statements she made, and she would say, "Well, that wasn't meant to be factual. I was just using poetic license. I was trying to put food on the table for my kids." And we went back and forth, and I wasn't her favorite person, at least then, and probably not now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, she got caught lying. I mean, and even a Yahoo article time, I don't know if you saw it, but they even said that she admitted she lied under oath
Well,
about that book.
Well, what she said was she kept using the word poetic license, that this wasn't meant to be factually precise, that I was taking poetic license. I was doing it to sell a book. I had to put food on the table for my kids. That was her explanation for it. So don't take everything I said and assume it's factual and precise, because
Sure.
that wasn't my intention in writing the book, and that wasn't what I did. And that's what she kept saying.
Okay. How did and Andrea Constant, I felt that her testimony was shady from things that I read because she, even in her first trial, she was forced to admit when she would give dates about Mr. Cosby and when this actually happened that she wasn't actually drugged on those days.
I'm going to let the appellate lawyers handle that issue,
Sure.
because
Okay.
the case is still on appeal. They petitioned the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to handle the appeal. So I'm not going to get into some of these other areas. I'm going to let the appellate lawyers do that.
Right. I understand, Tom. My mistake.
Okay.
Uh, Somebody wanted to ask, I don't know if I can ask you this, uh, but someone wanted to know about a Ponzi pyramid scheme you found out about Andrea Constant. Was that true?
I'm just going to let the appellate lawyers handle that.
I told y'all I couldn't answer that, ask that.
The record is the record. It's before the Supreme Court, as I understand it, of Pennsylvania. So I'm going to let them handle that.
Yeah, I understand. You don't want to, and this is in public, so yeah, I don't want you to say anything. But I can ask you this: have you stayed in touch with either Mr. Cosby or Mr. Wyatt?
Yes, I have. And I'm concerned for Mr. Cosby. I know that he's of advanced age, and as you correctly pointed out, he's blind, and he needs help getting around the prison. And my understanding is he's done a tremendous amount of good counseling others in the prison about how to approach life and how to reach their potential and how to do good deeds. And he's been a remarkable person in that prison, is my understanding. And I just hope his health doesn't suffer because of current conditions.
Right. We've written to the governor about it as well. And the other aspect too with this, Tom, is that this was a first offense, and given his age, given Mr. Cosby's also military record because he served in the Navy, I
Right,
believe, for 4 years. I
right.
think all of that should have been considered in his sentencing. But it is what it is. Obviously,
Hmm.
the judge apparently he had a bias in this case, and I'm sure you're aware things have come out where they're saying Bruce Castor, who was the former prosecutor, and the Judge O'Neill, were actually bitter rivals in a DA election.
Yes, I'm well aware of that. And I sort of alluded to that earlier. Mr. Castor, made an agreement. He admits he made an agreement, and why another DA is allowed to just scuttle the agreement is beyond me. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and Mrs. Cosby, I know she's a strong woman, and she's been hanging in there. Has she been doing okay?
I talked to Andrew quite a bit, and she is a strong woman. She's extremely bright. She has a PhD. She's been an educator. She's a very remarkable person, and my understanding is that she's hanging in there okay, and I wish her the very best. Very nice person.
Yeah, and all of this also happening when Mr. Cosby lost his daughter. A lot of people didn't know that his daughter died
Yeah,
in the middle of this trial. And
it
so,
was very sad, extremely sad.
yeah, yeah, I feel for that family because they've lost two children, you know,
Yes.
Enos Cosby as well. Yeah. So, someone, Tyree wanted to ask, how come Judge Robreno isn't in jail? I think he's referring to the judge that unsealed the deposition, but I don't think that's a reason why he could go to jail for unsealing that.
That's again, I'll leave that to the appellate
Yeah.
lawyers. He was a federal judge who, for reasons I don't understand, decided to unseal what everybody had agreed to seal.
Right.
And that
He
then
got
was used
reprimanded for that.
that then was used by the prosecutors, in the trial.
Yeah, well, I can just tell you the appellate court actually, the federal appeals court, actually, they agreed. They didn't overturn his decision to unseal it, but they criticized him. That was made public, but
Yes.
yeah. So let's see what other questions. Anybody else have any other questions for Tom in the chat box? Let's see what else. Oh, I do want to ask Tom, just overall with this coronavirus thing, how is California? So people that may not know, or your area, how is that going so far?
Oh, I think we're all in this together. I mean, California's got a lot of cases, and we're doing the lockdown like everyone else, the social distancing. We're all glued to the TV like everyone around the world. I mean, in my opinion, we're all in this together. We all have to hang in there and work together and defeat this thing. It's not just a national problem, it's an international problem.
Yeah,
So people are wearing masks. My family's wearing masks, so we're staying inside and trying to minimize any contact with anybody and minimize shopping and minimize banking. And, unless you're an essential business like auto repair or a grocery store or a restaurant that's allowed to do takeout, you're not supposed to be working or in business. It's a national crisis.
yeah. Well, whenever New Orleans and there's nobody on Bourbon Street, there's a problem. And I know it's everywhere now. Here in Louisiana, we're on stay-at-home orders. In some parishes, not in New Orleans, they have curfews in place. So I don't know if they have. That's kind of what I was asking. Did LA have a curfew or anything like that? Or
We don't have a formal curfew, but the mayor has requested that everyone use masks, and the governor has requested social distancing. And, basically, our cities are ghost towns,
right?
you know?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Uh, okay, I know what I wanted to ask you, Tom. It's about the Harvey Weinstein case. Did you get a chance to follow it?
I did follow it.
Would you mind giving your opinion on it?
Well, I wasn't in the courtroom. And unless you're in the courtroom, you can't really understand what's going on. But I thought the defense attorneys did a very good job. They seem very aggressive. They seem very prepared. Um, but again, this current trend where judges are allowing other accusers to come in to bolster the underlying case is very troubling. It's very problematic. And why should five other women or four other women be allowed to testify in a case where what they're claiming happened never was charged, is not in the indictment or in the criminal complaint? And it's just designed to make a trial impossible for the defense. They shouldn't be allowed to load up this way and make it a trial about other cases that were never charged, in my opinion.
Yeah, and even I've followed it brief, and I've even spoke to a friend of mine who was at the trial. Shout out to Drew Story News. He's actually in the chat box, and if you have YouTube time, I would suggest you could look at his documentary as well as Nicole's documentary they've done on the Cosby case. I'm sure you would enjoy it. But they were there when one of the witnesses who testified, she wrote the email, "Hey, big guy," or something along those lines, and continued to have a relationship with the man. Now, a lot of people think, and even me, that this is a sad trend that's coming, and I feel like the Me Too movement and Time's Up with these convictions, they're setting a precedent that's going to erode our 14th Amendment due process rights. Do you think it's going to be more difficult for attorneys to defend these type of cases?
Of course it is, because I think judges are politically scared. They're allowing prosecutors to bring in uncharged conduct, to bring in case after case that have nothing to do whatsoever with the underlying charges. You know, in the case of Bill Cosby, there was some of this alleged conduct happened 30 years ago. So
Right.
why let someone come in 30 years later when they never really made much of a complaint and there was no prosecution to make allegations? And how are you going to find witnesses and forensic evidence, and how are you going to properly defend? And it's all designed to prejudice the jury against the accused. It's designed to make due process more problematic and more virtually impossible for a defendant.
Right.
Focus on
No.
the underlying charges and let the defendant defend according to the Constitution and the law.
Right. Right. You know what's interesting on that note, in our evidence book, and I'm sure it's the same in California, you cannot question uh, the sexual history of the victim, but you can, or bring up the type of clothing they can wear. But the defendant, you can make and raise all types of things apparently about them without any proof, without any evidence. All they have to do is just get on the witness stand and say this happened to me. And the innocent until proven guilty standard, which is law throughout the country now, I believe it has changed to now guilty until proven guilty.
It's very
I was getting
troubling.
there. Yeah.
No, it's Me Too has done a lot of good, but it's also making our justice system far more problematic and far more difficult for anybody to defend a charge.
Yeah, most definitely.
You know,
Tremel Reed in the chat room, Tom asks, does Mr. Mesereau think Dr. Cosby can be released early due to COVID-19 by him not attending those classes? And I agree he shouldn't because he is innocent. Will that hinder him from, she didn't continue?
you'd have to ask his lawyers who are handling that, because I'm no
Yeah.
longer, representing him in this case. So they would be the ones to talk to about that.
Right. Well, Tom, because you were the attorney, everybody just starts asking all questions if you have all the answers. So, yeah. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, Tom, this was a great interview, and I can't tell you how ecstatic and how thankful I am that you were able to bless us and bless me today to talk with me and the family here on the chat box. And you're always welcome to come back. If you ever want to talk about anything, you have an open platform.
Well, thank you very much. I've been very honored to be on the show, and it was a great show, and best of luck to you. I appreciate it very much, Gavin.
Yeah, yes. And please come back. Tremel said, sorry, meant to say, will that hinder? Yeah, well, Tom's already answered that, Tremel, but we appreciate the question. Yeah, you get more of those. But yeah, I thank all of you all that were attending in here. And I don't have any more to say, Tom, except, be safe out there. Just everybody should know Tom does not have Facebook or Twitter, so don't ask me if what's his Twitter handle or anything like that. He stays away from social media. But I have your website, Tom, in the box at mesereaulaw.com, where people can go and see the work that you've done. And, if you're in the Los Angeles area and you need an attorney, of course, I guess talk to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Best of luck to everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And this is Gavin Rishaw with Gavin Rishaw Presents on channel GBoo 2786. You guys have a good night. Thank you. And please be safe. Stay home. You don't have to go out. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Gavin. Appreciate it.
And I'll send you that email.
Okay.
That website. Thank
Okay.
y'all.
Thank you.